4. And the roll call, please.
Commissioner Walters?
Here.
Commissioner Neely?
Here.
Commissioner Nacita?
Here.
Commissioner Roth? Commissioner Smith?
Here.
Commissioner Yates?
Here.
Commissioner Peterson?
Here.
Commissioner Shaw?
Here.
Commissioner Munn?
Here.
And Commissioner Edgar?
Here.
Item number 2, discussion items.
Chair Walters, if I could interrupt, Bill Kleisman, City Attorney, and an issue's come up that I've discussed with the manager that I want to bring before the commission and possibly add something to the agenda involving a covenant and for a portion of land. I think as the jug handle process move forward, there's approval of a mitigation area for some wetlands, and as a result of that, a covenant was signed by the City Commission of Oregon City that probably should have gone to the Urban Renewal, not probably, should have gone to the Urban Renewal Commission, and that ended up going there due to miscommunication in our office between us and the city. And as a result, we have a covenant on the jug handle project that was signed by the wrong body, and I would suggest that the Urban Renewal Commission might want to consider adding a new item to the agenda to deal with that covenant.
This is a work session. Would we have to call into a regular session to do that?
No, that's a good question, and the answer is no. The state public meetings law doesn't distinguish between work sessions and other meetings. There's either regular meetings, special meetings, and a subset of special meetings involving emergencies. This is a regularly scheduled meeting. It is listed as a work session, which is commonly understood to mean no decisions will be taken. However, it is a regular meeting, and the public records law specifically states that notice shall include a list of principal subjects anticipated considered meeting, but this requirement shall not limit the ability of the governing body to consider additional subjects. So there's nothing in state statute or city ordinance that prevents this commission from hearing a matter that's not on the agenda, even if it's been noticed as a work session.
I'm willing to entertain it as a discussion item as part of the work session. I'm not prepared to vote on this matter tonight.
I would prefer to vote on it. We're having actually the groundbreaking of the jug handle tomorrow, and I would prefer that when we do that, we in fact know that everything's in place.
Yes.
I too. I don't think I'd like to have a significant discussion about it because I think that it is counter the express policies of the Urban Renewal District, and I think we need to discuss it some first to see. I don't believe that it's appropriate for the Urban Renewal Commission to hold these lands in any status under these conditions, and should be in the hands of the city, and we just can't transfer it into the hands of the city without some type of compensation. And until we understand what that compensation is that's responsible to the taxpayers and to the Urban Renewal Commission, I think it's premature.
And I request this discussion come after the currently scheduled items.
Any other comments? Commissioner Easton?
This agenda doesn't include, typically during work sessions, we have suggestions for future agenda items. And that's not on the agenda tonight, and I have something to propose. So I don't know if you want me to propose it now or wait.
As a new agenda item or?
For a future agenda item, not for tonight, but for a future agenda item.
Let's see, where are we? Shall we take this topic first and then we can add the?
That's I don't mind it where it is in the agenda. I just want to have, you know, an agenda item on future agenda.
Okay, let's make a decision on this, and then we can take new agenda items, and then proceed to the next agenda item. Any other?
Well, are we going to bring this other item up at the end?
You're presenting asking if we can walk on an agenda item.
And take it after we've had these two?
That's fine.
Okay.
Okay, do we need a vote for that, or? Okay. Future agenda items?
Okay, I'd like to propose a future agenda item regarding the urban renewal records policy. 2 points I want to make, and I think this is probably going to be relevant to not only this commission, but other boards also. The first thing I want to bring up for a future agenda item relates to our executive session minutes. The city commission a while back, we passed a policy to retain executive session minutes permanently. State law or the Secretary of State's regulation only require a public body to retain executive session minutes for 10 years. And unfortunately, we have not retained minutes for 10 years. And I want to have this commission consider its own policy that would be similar to the one we passed on City Commission to retain executive session minutes permanently. The second point, it's also a transparency issue, a public records issue, and it might be a little more challenging, which is we have a lot of boards that are considered public bodies. This board, the library board, which have citizen appointees serving on them, conducting city business. And some of us, this board, the library board, meet in executive session. All the time I've served on various commissions like this, the citizens who participate correspond with city staff and with each other on official business, but using private email addresses. And I think I'm pretty sure that these correspondences would be public records. Whether they would fall under an exemption is one question, but they would be considered public records. And I think for the protection of the citizen, if litigation were to develop, it'd be a pretty sensitive thing to have, you know, private email accounts subpoenaed or something like that. So I'd like to have a discussion about whether the city could, for its citizen members sitting on boards, provide them with city email addresses so that they can have that protection that only such correspondences that are in fact city, official business actually be conducted with city email accounts, so we can protect, our citizens who are volunteers from any unwarranted intrusions in a worst case scenario. So those are my two future agenda items.
Okay, thank you. I want to suggest that since you have the 10-year window on the records retention policy, that we take that up as a lower priority item. I know we've got a lot of things on upcoming agendas to discuss, including goal setting, bylaws, potential renewal plan amendments. So I'm asking if it's okay for us to postpone that discussion
Um,
beyond, those other.
I would with the proviso that in the interim, we not destroy any records until we set this policy.
I don't know.
With that proviso, I don't have a problem with it.
Do you have any suggestions for how we might want to take those matters up?
You know, certainly you could, you know, direct staff to say, don't destroy any records to hold off on, you know, right now you have I can't remember whether the Urban Renewal Commission actually adopted its own policy or whether the default Secretary of State, you know, the policy schedules, that's what the word I was looking for, are in effect. To the extent you're either way, you probably need to take some action. You could direct staff to retain records and not follow the schedule, or you could continue to just work under the schedule that applies to, you know, the Urban Renewal Agency as well as all other public agencies in the state, and deal with it when the agenda opens up enough to let you do it. So it's really in your hands as to what you want to do.
We get that information by, say, June 30th?
The information about what the current schedule is? The current schedule, as Commissioner Lucia said, is executive session records are retained 10 years.
So are we following our own policy or the state policy?
My guess is Nancy, I would be the one who could best answer that question. I'm pretty sure it's state policy, but the question is whether or not you've adopted anything to specifically adopt state policy, or whether there has been no action taken by the Urban Renewal Agency to adopt state policy.
Would you feel comfortable speaking to this, or do you want us to wait for Nancy?
I could only speculate, because I believe it's I agree with Bill, I think it's the 10-year state law that we've adopted for urban renewal. So we just changed it for city commission to make them permanent. But I would check with Nancy to verify that, yes.
So if we can take this up by the forum is okay. All right, thank you. Any other future agenda topics? Okay, I guess we're ready to move on to the discussion items, number 2.
I have Tim Spencer from BEQ to address the landfill issues, and then after that we have Andy Parks here to talk about the financial impact. So at this point, I'm going to turn over to Tim Spencer.
Good evening, Commissioners. Thank you for inviting me. My name is Tim Spencer, and I work for the Department of Environmental Quality in our Northwest Region Solid Waste Program. And I've been working in that area for many years at DEQ and elsewhere. First, I'd like to kind of summarize a little bit about how DEQ regulates Rawson's landfill, and I don't have a long formal presentation or anything, and I'm sure you have a lot of questions.
DEQ regulates the landfill under a solid waste closure permit, and that permit has been in effect basically since the landfill closed in 1983. Prior to that, we regulated the site under an operations, what we call an operations permit. When various redevelopment ideas have come to light, DEQ has expanded our approach, and that's the case with the Rivers project. Because a solid waste permit is very limited in terms of the authority that it gives us, it's not extremely nimble to deal with a redevelopment project, for example. So when I'm jumping right into the Rivers project, but when the Rivers project came to light, it was clear that we would have to, DEQ would have to regulate that proposal or the future development under a completely different set of regulations and under a different program, which would be DEQ's cleanup statute and regulations, which give us really broad latitude to regulate brownfields projects and actually how a contaminated site like an old landfill would need to be developed to end up with a project that's safe to the public and environmentally safe. So when this proposal came to light, DEQ underwent negotiations with the various parties, including Rossman's landfill or Park Place Development, and in this particular go-around, this is not the first proposal, and of course, you're all familiar with Home Depot, but and CenterCal, and we've been negotiating, or had been negotiating for quite a long time, for a number of years, on something we call a consent order, which would be a legal agreement between DEQ and the landfill owner, and a consent judgment, which would be a legal agreement between DEQ and a prospective developer. One thing that we anticipate that might happen under any kind of redevelopment of this site might be the parceling off or dividing of the property. That's another area where the existing permit lacks the nimbleness to adjust to that. It's really designed for one party, one ownership, whereas a consent order or consent decree can be tailored for a lot of different situations. So DEQ spent a lot of time negotiating these two agreements with these two parties, and those agreements are still in draft form, and they contain basically what DEQ's vision is of how such a development could proceed in a safe manner, and what sort of engineering controls would be necessary, and what kind of environmental monitoring and safeguards. And when I say environmental monitoring, I mean before, during, and after the development on into the future. Switching gears a little bit, I want to go back to the basics of how DEQ has regulated this site historically under the permit. For decades, the landfill has been required to monitor groundwater quality, leachate quality, and landfill gas, primarily methane gas. Methane is a potential explosion hazard, and the pathway of concern regarding methane in terms of explosion hazards is really subsurface movement through soils into a confined space like a building that's poorly ventilated. The monitoring that we've required of the landfill historically and currently is designed to prevent that sort of thing from happening. When you develop directly on a landfill, it's a very different situation. We're no longer looking at the prospect of gas perhaps threatening adjoining properties, but rather the structures and the people occupying the landfill development itself. And again, the solid waste permit doesn't really adequately address those issues. In the case of the Home Depot project, as many of you may be aware, it's anything but a typical Home Depot below the surface. It has extensive engineering controls and monitoring capabilities that a normal Home Depot would have to protect the customers, the employees, and the public, and also to prevent the Home Depot store from exacerbating problems associated with the underlying landfill. Those are all sorts of questions and concerns that we have been attempting to address for this new development and would for any proposed redevelopment on the rest of the site. Another piece of DEQ's regulatory approach on the site has been the long-term groundwater quality monitoring that I mentioned. I know questions have come up about benzene and other issues. The landfill is surrounded by groundwater monitoring wells, and the landfill has been required to monitor those wells for decades. And back in the late 80s, the landfill owner conducted a comprehensive hydrogeologic investigation of the landfill itself, and essentially the entire floodplain area surrounding the landfill and bounded by the Clackamas River and the Willamette River. And that's all information is all available in the public record. One of the important things that found, and just to get at the groundwater issue a little bit, is that there's a shallow alluvial aquifer that underlies the landfill and the floodplain area. That aquifer has been impacted by Rossman's landfill, by the old Rossman's landfill across the freeway. I don't know if you're all familiar with that site, and by other activities and facilities in the area. So one thing we found from this hydrogeologic investigation was that there are many and multiple sources of contamination affecting the shallow aquifer. Not all toxic in nature, but such that the water quality has been impaired by a number of different sites. Because of that situation, in our original closure permit, we required that some sort of ordinance be passed to ban the use of the shallow groundwater. That's now an existing Oregon City ordinance. And that shallow aquifer was not really used for water supply or other beneficial purposes historically, other than the now defunct Rainy collector that the city of Gladstone used as a backup water supply. That's no longer used, but the deeper basalt bedrock aquifer is also monitored under the DEQ permit, and there's no evidence that there has been any effect on that aquifer.
Just a quick question on the Gladstone intake. That was tied to the shallow aquifer you're mentioning?
Yes, and the riverbed. Essentially, a rainy collector is kind of a unique beast. It's like a giant well that's basically drawing river water through river gravel, sands and gravels, acting as a big filter. but in the process of creating a drawdown, it's also pulling in some groundwater from the banks and the shallow aquifer. But a lot of what it was taking in was just filtered Clackamas River water. And I don't want to take up a lot of your time, so maybe we need to get to some questions now.
The cove water, does the aquifer allow water to come from Rossman 1 and Rossman 2 landfills and get into the cove? Because the way I look at it, the Gladstone water intake system is right at the edge of the cove, and if it was contaminated, it would lead me to believe that the cove water would equally have the potential of contamination into it.
Right. There's no doubt that the shallow aquifer is discharging into the cove, but one important point is that getting back to the big landfill, it has been monitored for decades, and the level of toxic compounds in the shallow aquifer were never very high, but have declined steadily over the years. The high benzene level that I think someone had concern has been raised about that was really in a report on the other Rossman's landfill, the one on the other side of the freeway. That's not to say that the newer and larger Rossman's landfill is also releasing volatile organic compounds, which benzene is in that category, into the groundwater. But as I said, the levels have declined steadily. The DEQ cleanup program has decided many years ago that the contaminant levels involved in the shallow aquifer were not such that any aggressive cleanup beyond this ordinance would be necessary. And there are also other water quality effects in the groundwater from the landfill, from both the landfills and from some of the other sites, in the form of non-toxic or non-hazardous constituents. Examples of those would be metals like iron and manganese that are naturally occurring in the shallow groundwater, but landfill leachate causes those metals to go way up in concentration, such that the water quality is impaired, mainly from a taste and odor standpoint. But the landfill is continuing to be monitored. We allowed the landfill owner to reduce the amount of monitoring and the frequency of monitoring because they had such a long history and no drastic changes were occurring other than this gradual decline in contaminant levels. Any other questions at this point?
Have you experienced other brownfield conditions like this in your area that you oversee?
Quite a few. There's been a huge interest in redeveloping properties of this nature in the Portland area, and of course the existing Home Depot and driving range being two examples of that. Redeveloping old landfills is very challenging, no question about it. The Home Depot is sitting on 1,250 pilings, but there are different ways to approach some of the problems at hand, and a perfect example of that is how on the same site, how the driving range and the Home Depot are so different. The driving range, being a really lightweight structure, was designed to be intrinsically safe. It's a very simple approach. The building is elevated on adjustable stilts, essentially, with a large airspace under it, with some nice lattice work and whatever. There are no pilings. It's very lightweight. The foundation area under it was treated by what we call preloading in engineering, where you just apply a designed fill of a certain thickness and density for a prescribed period of time to help compact the underlying, in this case, solid waste material, to minimize future settlement. So the driving range structure has none of the extensive engineering controls of the Home Depot. When you put in something bigger and heavier and more complicated, you need more complicated engineering controls. So and structural features like the pilings, for example. Those pilings have cathodic protection to prevent corrosion because they're metal, and the landfill environment is quite corrosive. Another example of the more complexity. But the Home Depot is a fairly old project now, and we've seen a lot of other developments of this type. The Bridgeport Village Shopping Center down by Durham being another example. It's a very different type of landfill, but as it turns out, they have a fairly serious methane gas problem. So when you walk around the Bridgeport Village, you probably don't realize that a lot of these little plates and so on resting in amongst the nice cobblestone streets and sidewalks are actually little covers for gas extraction wells or monitoring probes, etc. So that they have quite extensive engineering controls on that project to deal with the methane issues, and very extensive ongoing monitoring to verify that everything is working okay. That's absolutely critical. All the bells and whistles and safety measures are worthless if you don't maintain them really well and keep monitoring them indefinitely. I'm sorry. Yes?
Two quick questions. Number one, you're going to be exacerbating areas that have not previously been, or for many, many years, been exposed to oxygen, therefore decomposition. So when you go down with the pilings, that will be exposing some things that have not been exposed to oxygen in many years. But what has that done, or what do you expect that to do on a new development, and what has it shown at Home Depot when they did that? Was there any exacerbation or increase in the...
We didn't see any effect there, and the one thing that oxygen would do is greatly inhibit methane production because it's toxic to methanogenic bacteria. So if there had been a significant introduction of oxygen into the landfill in the area of the Home Depot store, that would have resulted in a decline in methane generation. However, methane concentrations are quite high below the Home Depot facility, in fact, higher than I would like them to be, and higher than we expected. I don't think that's a big concern unless there was a continuous source of oxygen. When I watched the pilings go in, and they were pounded in like butter, they went down in minutes, and clang when they hit, you really knew when they hit the gravel below the landfill. The one thing that we were concerned about a number of things related to the piling installation, and so we required a period of intensive monitoring during and after the installation of the pilings to make sure that they didn't exacerbate groundwater quality, for example. When you drive a piling through a landfill, we envisioned, well, what if there are some old drums buried in there? what if it creates a short circuit, driving contamination more quickly and further into the aquifer. The monitoring really showed that there wasn't any discernible effect. And one of the main reasons you might think, why did DEQ ever allow a bunch of holes or pilings to be punched through the landfill? What we saw, for example, in the Home Depot project, was really a way of enhancing the landfill environmentally, or we would have never gone for that project at all. And so even though the pilings represented a potential short-term exacerbation, the construction of a large building and impervious surfaces associated with the parking lot created, at least in that 18-acre area, a greatly enhanced cap to prevent water from infiltrating into the landfill, which to us is by far one of the largest concerns with any big old landfill of this nature. And in our negotiations on the consent order and consent judgment that I referred to earlier, our expectation is that this isn't just any redevelopment on this site, whether it's a park, a golf course, a driving range, a shopping center. Our expectation is that the end result is going to be more protective environmentally than where we started. And the way that we think we can get there is, let's say with a park, even if it were something simple like a park, we would expect enhanced gas control to protect the public who would be going onto the site and using the park. In fact, we would have to look at human health risks in the whole analysis. Inhaling, increased inhalation of gas, because in a park you wouldn't have the enhanced cap situation of building foundations, pavement, etc. One legal factor that enters into the consent judgment with the prospective developer in the Rivers case is what we call prospective purchaser status. That's a brownfields term where we relieve a prospective purchaser from the environmental liability of past practices in exchange for a whole bunch of things. And that whole bunch of things would include environmental enhancements. Many of you have probably been to the South Waterfront in downtown Portland or the Pearl District. Those are both brownfields areas that no one would touch with a 10-foot pole because of the environmental liability, and the prospective purchaser agreement program has kind of jump-started that. Our thought would be to approach anything on Rawson's landfill the same way. That answer your question?
Partly, the other part of the concern was once Home Depot was installed, there was migration of methane across Washington Street, which necessitated new dry wells or whatever being put in for sampling. Would you anticipate the same migration?
We are expecting the same potential problem, and in retrospect, all the data that we had concerning gas generation at Rawson's landfill indicated much less of a buildup of methane than actually occurred. So in some ways, in many ways, in fact, the Home Depot project was under-designed to deal with off-site migration, and we have definitely taken that into account in the negotiating of the consent order and the consent judgment very specifically. In fact, it's pretty much in black and white that there will be much more aggressive extraction of gas the Home Depot engineering controls were, by engineering controls, I mean the methane gas control system was designed simply to evacuate the foundation area under the building. Based on the data that was available from around the landfill in general, indicated that they simply needed to protect that zone right under the foundation. So it's not a very aggressive system. A more aggressive system would include what we call vertical extraction wells that are standard technology at all large operating landfills like River Bend and Columbia Ridge in eastern Oregon, where Portland's waste goes. But a vertical extraction well, you can put a lot of vacuum on that. The Home Depot system was a low vacuum system. So we learned some lessons from that whole issue. No question about it.
Walmart walked away about 5 years ago from a large 135,000 square foot store in Ohio built on a landfill. Is there anything that we can learn from why Walmart walked away from that type of development of significance?
Absolutely. There's probably a lot you can learn. I would definitely look whatever information you can get on the specific characteristics of that site, because landfills vary so much in terms of what went in them and their physical configuration. Depth is a really big factor. I don't know anything about the landfill you're talking about, but let's say if it was 150 feet thick versus Rossman's landfill averages about 45 feet in thickness, which makes it quite a thin landfill by relatively speaking. That's a lot more manageable typically than a landfill that's 100, 200. Some California canyon landfills are hundreds of feet thick. That would be really, really difficult to work with. So if you can find out the name of this facility, I'd be really interested to find out exactly what went wrong and why.
I'll get you the information.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I have a question regarding the capping you discussed. I understand that the desire not to have water percolate into the landfill and then into the even the shallow aquifer. What and maybe Home Depot is the example here, but how did that impact, for example, if a cap is really designed to be hard and impermeable, how does that impact one, design of stormwater? Because typically one of the strategies for stormwater is to let it percolate. And secondly, landscaping. Can you still have big trees with big root systems when you're trying to have that strategy to keep percolation from happening?
Right. You're definitely more limited with on an old landfill in terms of landscaping and the idea with, and also with managing stormwater. Under no circumstances would you want to allow it to percolate into the landfill. So you have to, in a project of this nature, you have to plan for some sort of off-site percolation. I mentioned the Bridgeport Village project. They had to, I forget how they acquired it, but they acquired adjoining property simply to manage their stormwater because they couldn't allow it to percolate back into the landfill. So the whole idea with the advantage of the impervious surface is gone when you collect all that water and then percolate it back into the landfill. That just wouldn't work. In some instances, that can turn out to be a serious limiting factor or even a fatal flaw in a project. As far as vegetation goes, it's more challenging, but you can do a lot of creative things with plants on landfills. One example is to construct landscaping berms where in localized areas you add a lot thicker soil than you have everywhere else. Soil is so expensive, you wouldn't want to add soil of that thickness everywhere, but where you wanted larger plants like trees, you could create these zones of thicker soil, for example.
So the large trees, you think, Tim, are kind of out of the question for that?
I wouldn't say they're out of the question, but you'd have to look at it really closely. It would be challenging, that's for sure. But the method that I mentioned might be one way to do something like that.
The installation of the monitoring equipment, I presume that's the responsibility of the developers, but do you have regular staff or mechanisms that DEQ, in fact, is doing the monitoring?
What monitoring are you referring?
If in fact the project goes forward, you're going to have monitoring devices, and how is that data collected? How is it analyzed?
Right. There would be data from automated sensors like they have at Home Depot, and then there would be manual monitoring points, including what we call gas monitoring probes, and perhaps additional. There are already quite a few groundwater monitoring wells around the landfill, but the project may require increased groundwater monitoring as well. That would be the actual monitoring would be the responsibility of the developer or the landfill owner, depending on whether it winds up being a sale or a lease or how there would be one or the other. There was an additional legal document under negotiation actually between Park Place Development and CenterCal that was an agreement between them that laid out the responsibilities in terms of who would do what under what circumstances. But from DEQ's perspective, there would be one or the other would be mainly responsible, and they would have to report that information to us, and then we would review the monitoring information for any changes, trends, etc. And they would also be required to report, submit regular reports summarizing all the findings from like annual monitoring and reporting any problems, trends, etc.
How do you validate the data, though? I mean, how if the developer is responsible for the data, or however it's worked out, as at least the landlord, how do you assure that the data is accurate?
In our review of it, we can detect anomalies that don't make sense. We've had sites that have dry labbed in the past, and when you see that nothing changes, that would be one example of that. We also, in terms of groundwater sampling, our lab routinely does what we call split sampling to check on the techniques of the responsible party, and that would be one thing that would be done on the water quality end.
We had an issue in Stimson's on the mill here in Oregon City, and when Blue Heron took it over, it indicated, they stated that the reports that had been submitted, and I don't know if it was on stormwater management or if it was other water management, were in fact erroneous and intentionally. The fact that, of course, they got fined afterwards, it was that they reported those errors themselves. So how do you guarantee that the data is not, I mean, you say you've got things that you can look at, but how, if you're not in control of the monitoring device and the information, how do you assure this, the monitoring is accurate?
Right. Well, I mentioned one approach would be split sampling. Is something that we do routinely with water quality monitoring. On the gas end, we have our own equipment at sites that we suspect or have any reason to think that their data might be bad or their techniques might be bad. We will spot check them with our instrument and with gas monitoring to see if our results agree with theirs. We don't have, DEQ doesn't have the staff to have people out on a really regular basis checking everybody's test results, but there's quite a bit of regulation now of the qualifications of laboratories, and the individuals who are taking the samples are usually professional consultants who have a license, and so they're putting themselves and their livelihood on the line. So there's some self-regulation there.
Along that same line, when we did the DEQ permits on the blue heron air quality, we found that blue heron's air quality was being monitored somewhere in southeast Portland because there's not enough, DEQ doesn't have the staff or the equipment. So how can we be assured that we're getting test results from this site rather than somewhere over in St. Helens or?
Right. That shouldn't be a problem with the media that are involved in this site. Air quality is kind of unique in that respect because pollutants carried by the wind can go, travel such long distances. So in the case of groundwater quality monitoring or landfill gas monitoring, it's being done at the immediate site in question.
DEQ has the staff in it to do that?
Like I was saying earlier, that would be the responsibility of the developer or Park Place Development to do the routine monitoring and then report all those results to DEQ. Also, that involves interpreting the results by a licensed professional consultant, either a registered geologist or engineer or engineering geologist.
The CH2M Hill that Mr. Parker's been having.
Yes.
Mr. Yates?
How many landfills and other kinds of facilities like this is DEQ monitoring throughout the state right now?
You mean old closed landfills?
Well, I mean, basically, you're going to be getting a report if this problem goes forward. But I'm just kind of curious, how many reports does DEQ now have of this general ilk? My follow-on is how quickly do you get to them? How's your staffing? What's your budget look like next year? And what's the process for getting these things reviewed professionally by DEQ, now and going forward?
Right. First of all, we're divided up into regions, so we don't. In my office here in Portland, we don't have to worry about what's going on around the rest of the state. We have a prescribed region in Northwest Oregon, so we're not spread over the entire state. We are really busy, and we're there's no question that our budget is under great scrutiny, and I wouldn't say that we have an overabundance of staff, that's for sure.
How long does it take to get to how often would a report be submitted from this landfill to DEQ under your consent agreement?
It could, with the gas side of things, it could be as frequently as monthly.
And how long would it take DEQ to actually review a monthly? It's going to be monthly, every 6 months, and an annual report too. I mean, what are the reporting requirements? And I'm kind of curious what the review process is.
anything involving landfill gas is a higher priority for us because of the immediacy of the risk. We're looking at explosion hazards with methane, and that's one consideration. Secondly, the data is a lot less voluminous and straightforward and easy to review than groundwater chemistry. So the turnaround is usually a lot better with this type of monitoring. So we're probably talking about within a month, something like that.
Going back to following up on some of the other questions that have been asked, at some of these other sites that you've worked on that involve reuse of brownfields and landfills, take Bridgeport, for example. Has Bridgeport, in the history of this use, ever had any lawsuits or enforcement actions relating to environmental issues or?
No, nothing like that at Bridgeport in particular. No incidents that I'm aware of.
Any other sites? I mean, what's when you say explosion hazards? I mean, what's the worst you've seen in a site like this? What's the worst case scenario, and how do we protect ourselves?
Right. There was an explosion at Woodburn landfill about 10 years ago. That was actually they have a municipal waste ash landfill. They have an incinerator, a solid waste incinerator called the Brooks facility, where they burn municipal garbage, and the residual ash goes into a lined landfill. And they had a scale house that weighed the incoming ash and so on. But in the distance was the old municipal landfill that they had operated for years before the incinerator. And one day they had a near record barometric pressure event, low barometric pressure event. And landfill gas is influenced quite a bit by weather, by barometric pressure, and we have to take all that into account in assessing the risk and performing ongoing monitoring. But during that extreme low pressure event, what that did was it created a stronger effective pressure for the gas within the landfill, the old landfill. It was hundreds of feet away from this scale house, and these folks came in one morning, flipped on the switch, and got blown out of the building, basically. And there have been incidents like this around the country, none involving a redevelopment project that I'm aware of, but interestingly, a really good thing to check out is the city of Los Angeles. They have their building department has the best methane-related building codes in the world, I suspect, because of the extensive naturally occurring methane associated with the oil fields. They had a really bad explosion. Again, I think it was something like 10 years ago. Commercial business exploded because this naturally occurring methane seeped into the building and had no protective measures. So now they have all these areas in a certain part of Los Angeles that have high methane. Now what do you do? Well, they have what's called a methane hazard zone. And if you build anything within the methane hazard zone, you have to follow this code, which includes all kinds of engineering measures and monitoring, and some of them pretty basic things, but it's a lot of it is about awareness of how gas moves and what causes it to move, like this low barometric pressure event. at Bridgeport Village, we have a protocol established there for what we call severe weather monitoring. Whenever there's a weather event that meets certain criteria, their consultants have to run out and do extra non-routine monitoring to make sure that severe weather event didn't trigger something unexpected. So it's there's a lot involved.
One more question. Does your district cover Eugene?
Oh.
Okay. Are you not familiar with the landfill issue with the developer in January that just sued the city of Eugene?
Actually, I have worked on a project in Eugene because I get involved in methane-related projects sometimes in the rest of the state. Are you talking about the Lane Plywood and Bethel Danabo landfill? Yeah, they built an office park, business park, on an old landfill that closed in the 1970s, and also developed some businesses around the edges of the landfill. And I think there was a legal battle between the city or the county and the developer because the problems weren't anticipated originally, so the developer spent a bunch of money and eventually went under. They were never able to build out on the landfill itself in that particular case.
Couple of questions.
Okay.
I'm curious, what kind of, do you know of incentive programs that any developer might be able to pursue to mitigate the costs associated with redevelopment? And my second question is, what are the biggest unknowns with regard to this site?
Could you explain your first question again a little bit?
Just curious if there are any kind of incentive programs, like through EPA or any redevelopment incentive programs that would offset the cost of mitigation.
I mentioned the prospective purchaser agreement program, which is a brownfields program that relieves a prospective developer of the environmental liability of related to past practices. In other words, if you agree to do certain things to improve the environment at the site, then you won't be held liable if, let's say, somebody's well is impacted by the historic disposal of waste in that area.
Well, who is liable in that case?
That would be the original owner who this person or persons presumably purchased the property from, or it would be dealt with by DEQ as an orphan site if that other party was defunct or left the country or
As
whatever.
the governing municipality, is there any risk of that liability being settled upon the city or on the Urban Renewal Agency?
Very unlikely, because DEQ doesn't have generator liability in this state. Federal EPA does. In other words, we would go after a landfill owner and a property owner, not all the people who put waste in the landfill. Our cleanup law doesn't provide for that generator liability.
How do we absolutely protect the city to ensure that if some environmental conditions arise from a redevelopment of this site, where if you put together this agreement with the new developer, that it just, where we have a firewall, a period firewall that says nothing comes back on the citizens or the city of Oregon City?
I'm not a lawyer, but I don't see, from what I know about the cleanup law and environmental statutes, I don't see how the city would get sucked into the liability, again, because the city has been a generator of some of the waste that went into the landfill, but we don't have generator liability. And your legal counsel would be a better source of information on that. But the other thing is for all of us is that no matter what's done or not done is on this property, making sure that that it's safe, especially any form of redevelopment is an opportunity to improve the situation. Before the Bridgeport Village Shopping Center went in, there was all this methane there that no one even knew about that was going wherever it wanted to go. And so the redevelopment project was an opportunity to get funding to characterize the site, and that's how the problem was discovered. And number two, to mitigate the problems once it was discovered. Here we have a different situation. We have a site where a lot of the history is known. There aren't any surprises. Actually, you asked about unknowns, and I didn't really.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that again.
You didn't really
And
answer
also,
that.
could I follow up? So you have a situation with Blue Heron. I know there's some concern about the legacy that gets left behind. If there were some sort of bankruptcy with the developer, are you saying that DEQ would then be responsible for that site?
DEQ wouldn't be liable, but DEQ would make sure that it didn't pose a risk to public health and safety or the environment, however, through whatever means we have at our disposal, which in some cases includes accessing funding that we have for situations where there's no viable responsible party. So
Would the city ever be considered a viable responsible party in that scenario?
I don't know the history of ownership or anything of that on that site, so it's hard for me to answer that. Does the city ever own the property, or?
I believe that there are parcels that are owned either by Urban Renewal Agency or the city.
Uh-huh.
Not on Rocky.
No, but on Blue Heron.
You're talking about Blue Heron in this case.
We do have, I don't know, I don't know exactly where the landfill at begins and ends, but I know that we do have properties in that vicinity, so.
Well, we're selling some urban renewal land to the developer as part of the disposition and development agreement.
I think you might own land over
That
there.
hasn't been determined yet. Actually, that parcel is not on his development plan, so at this point, I don't believe that's going to happen. And that piece you're speaking to is adjacent to, but it's not on the land.
Subject to migration.
So, I don't know if you still are able to answer the other question about the unknowns.
I seriously doubt if there are any significant unknowns related to this site because of the many years that it has been monitored and the age of it. Groundwater movement, for example, is very slow, and so we've been able to look at the effects over a really long period of time. Things don't change very quickly. We were surprised by the amount of gas under the Home Depot store because data from other parts of the landfill indicated that there was very little gas production remaining. Everyone involved has definitely learned a lesson from that exercise, and the was envisioned for anything new would be very different than the Home Depot approach. There could be unknown materials in the landfill, but the quantity involved is very unlikely to be significant. It was not a hazardous waste landfill. It took mainly municipal garbage, but people put weird things in their garages and they throw it away, and that's where the sensitivity of monitoring nowadays is such that when you're looking at a part per billion of benzene, for example, if you detect a part per billion of benzene, it doesn't mean that a landfill accepted all kinds of drums of benzene. That could come just from the leakage from a fuel line in your heavy equipment that you're operating on the landfill. So monitoring is very sensitive. We've never gotten really high concentrations of toxic chemicals that I'm aware of there.
Would you say that there's sufficient sampling areas to make that assessment that it's relatively improbable?
I would say so, and also the extent of the hydrogeologic investigation that I mentioned also indicates a site that has a lot of good natural protection, not for the shallow aquifer necessarily, because the landfill was excavated right into it, but in terms of impacting regional groundwater in this deeper aquifer, there's a third geologic formation overlying that aquifer known as the Sandy River Mudstone. That's extremely thick and highly impervious, very low in permeability. And so when you look at all the different factors associated with environmental risk, at least from the groundwater standpoint, I think gas issues are by far the most critical at this site because of the immediacy of the risk involved.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Very educational.
Yes.
Very fine.
Appreciate you coming here tonight. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Would you come to the front?
My name is Scott Parker, and I own Park Place Development and the property you've been talking about. I understand this is a work session, but I invited our CH2M representative, Eric Aronson, to the meeting, and I know you asked a lot of questions of Tim in regards to the sampling and other things, and Eric is here and can also answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you.
Okay.
Appreciate it.
I provided with Eric a handout to you guys back in January regarding the history of the landfill. It's very close to what Tim provided to you. I want to make sure you all have copies of it.
Thank you very much. Does anybody have any questions for the consultant? I do. I have one. Tim, just state your name for the record, please.
Yes, Eric Jackson, I'm with CH2 Hill.
Thank you. Tim referenced the fact that they were surprised by the amount of methane underneath the Home Depot once they got going on the project. So what would be the factors that we'd use to make sure we weren't surprised with something like that with this?
I can tell you from what they did, or what was in developing the consent judgment and consent order. Part of that was developing scope of work that both parties would be responsible for if anything moved forward. And one of the large responsibilities of CenterCal was to basically develop this very large comprehensive system that would extract gas from beneath the landfill. That system is vastly different than what Home Depot currently has. It includes an entire network of perimeter probes, or gas extraction wells on the perimeter of that, as well as in the interior of that.
In addition to the 23 or whatever that's already there?
Yeah, these were, the ones existing currently are, across from Home Depot. But these would be within or around the entire portion of the Centertown property to basically not only pull stuff within, but pull stuff back along the perimeter. So the direction of flow would always be in the subsurface towards the property, not away from it. And, the spacing, the things that go into determining those things would all be based on actually, not only designing, but going out testing it, making sure it functions to do that, and then monitoring to verify that that is occurring as well.
Creating a negative flow into the property. Okay, and can you repeat, is it called a gas extraction well system?
Yes, that's what we call it.
Thanks, Eric.
All right, thank you very much. Appreciate it. And are we ready to move on to agenda item 2D? Or is there
The second item, again, this was a request of the commission as a result of our discussion on the DEA. And I know one of the main concerns from the financial end of this project was the scenario, what happens if property values continue to decrease? How does that affect the ability of the district to pay the debt service? And how does that affect the projection of property taxes? So we had Andy Parks run a couple different scenarios on those items, and he's here to present those to you, and we'll also ask questions.
I have a question up front.
Sure.
There were other issues in executive session that I don't see addressed in here. Are we going to address those in executive session or at another meeting?
No, we plan to do those in another meeting. We didn't think we would have enough time to have both DEQ and Andy here.
Okay, thank you.
Our feeling was we wanted to get some of the information out first.
Thank you.
Good evening, Madam Chair and Commissioners. Andy Parks, I'm with Gel Oregon. I've been doing financial work on this endeavor and other urban renewal projects for the agency for several years now. And as Dan indicated, there's some information that's in this presentation, and I understand you guys have a hard copy of that, and I'll go through that at a fairly high level. And you feel free to address any questions you may have during the course of the discussion, and hopefully get all your questions addressed. And I also understand you have a copy of the Rossman landfill site report that I prepared back in February, and if you have questions about that, also I'd be glad to cover those as well. At a high level, I wanted to look again at kind of a funding summary for you related to the real market value that would be necessary in order to support what is in the current draft of the DDA in terms of the potential maximum reimbursement. That particular amount is a dated cost estimate, and you should be aware of that, and will require updating as well as verification process to ultimately ascertain if that's a good number or not. But the evaluation to date is based on the information that we do have. You see lots of colors up there, and there are two different major scenarios that I've looked at. The real market value providing the debt coverage of the debt service on, again, $17.65 million reimbursed back to the district, which is a roughly $20 million bond deal.
DCR is debt coverage ratio.
Yes, which basically is saying that you have net revenues of 1.25 times the annual debt service, which is roughly $1.9 million on a $20 million bond for 15 years. The columns that are on the right side of the chart are reflecting the real market values necessary just to cover the debt service. In other words, no additional monies coming in. The chart or the column on the far left represents current market conditions within the bond market, which is roughly about a 4.75% interest rate, 15-year term, with a 1-year debt service reserve. The column off to the far right would show interest increasing to 8% at the time this particular deal might come together, with the debt coverage ratio increasing to 1.35. You might ask, how did I get to 8 into 1.35? In discussions with Doug Olsby, Senior Vice President with Bank of America, which is the banking entity you currently have existing urban renewal debt with, he's indicated that interest rates right now in the 4.75 range. On a high end, as we look at things historically, we have not seen an 8 in the entire 23 years I've been doing local government finance. But prior to that time, we did see some things out there in the 15-year range that were up to 8%. So if you look at a long-term 30-plus year window, you may see some things in that range. Also on the debt coverage ratio side, although 1.25 is the current ratio, with tight money, if that were to continue, there's the possibility that they might look at a higher debt coverage ratio, and particularly if real estate values continue to struggle.
Could I interrupt for a second? I've heard 4.75 and I've seen 5.75.
Right. On the green bar, they range from 4.75 in the current situation, and sorry, I didn't put the 4.75 on the far left column, and then increasing all the way over to 8% on the far right of each of those sets.
So the blue on the far left is the 4.75.
Yes. In both situations, the current would be a 4.75 with a 1.25 coverage ratio.
Okay.
Okay. The taxable assessed value on that property, using today's conversion factor in your taxable assessed value to real market value ratio, that's approximately 75%. You see the same information, but ultimately reduced by that factor. And I think this will be relevant to some of the discussion that will be here a little bit later. The ratio of 75% is an increased ratio from when we first started the conversation with CenterCal. That ratio was really around 58% when we first started in fiscal 09, and it's increased to 64.3 in fiscal 10. In the current year, it's about 71.4, and it's projected to be around 75. Next year, and then I'll show you a little bit about that stabilizing in the projections going forward. I think you've probably seen this particular chart in the report on the Rossman landfill site issued in February. What this is ultimately showing, the assumption again on the left side, which is $200 million in real market value created, $17.65 million reimbursement. That reimbursement coming all at once, although there is a provision within the DDA to have part of that money being reimbursed earlier before the project's substantially complete. And there's another couple slides here that I'll touch on that. And it's showing roughly 20% getting completed by fiscal 12, 60%, 85% up to 100% by fiscal 12 or by the end of 12/15. The little squiggly line in front of the 2.2 million that's an approximate number of pre-TIF bond sale taxes that would be paid. And again, those have not been netted out of the this particular screen here as it relates to debt service or maximum debt service, and including I think all factors you'd be looking at a debt issue related to this particular project in the neighborhood of $17.5 million to $20.2 million.
Is this assuming a 3% increase in taxes value every year?
No, this really isn't looking at it as it relates to the TIF bond sale, not necessarily, but I'll touch on that one here in a few minutes. is that same chart. The red area off to the left before the bond issue would be funded, which is, again, I believe the current DDA language is in the neighborhood of 85% of substantial completion of the project. It calls for property taxes created from, or tax increment created from this particular property being set aside and used to reimburse the developer, at the time of substantial completion. That approximately is, $2.2 million. Again, that blue line or the blue area is representative of a full bond issue, not necessarily the reduced amount. So that's about $1.9 million per year. And that would be, I think the estimate at the maximum level, the development got all done at once with no prepayment of the taxes collected prior to substantial completion. If you were to look at the $2.2 million being repaid in accordance with the DDA, then you'd be looking at debt service ultimately being about $1,658,000 a year instead of the $1.9 million, which is roughly $234,000, $236,000 annually less, which would again reduce some real market value requirements to ultimately cover your debt. And that's what this particular chart is here. And I've taken out a few of the things you saw on the first slide and dealing with kind of a worse, best case scenario, current type of terms in a worst case scenario. And I apologize in advance, the purple lines on the far right of each of these stacks, and in going through a final review before the presentation, those numbers should be increased. If you were to look at the purple column on the left side, that number should be $232 million, so that bar is a little bit higher. And the column set on the right side, that bar should go up to $172 million. So what this is showing is each of the higher bars in here, paying debt service with 1 1/4 coverage or debt service alone. The higher bars are representing the real market values in the fully funded situation where you're paying the full amount all at once, issuing again around $20 million of debt. The lower bars represent you paying the debt or issuing the debt after you've paid $2 million, $2.2 million with pre-substantial completion tax increment collected. So you can see, in the scenario, again, on the left-hand side, $200 million is the target number right now, with interest rates, rising up to 5.75%, you are roughly $200 million or less. So you have adequate, coverage, real market value created to ultimately cover the debt. Where you would run into some challenges would be in the event that, interest rates, crept up to 8%, then you'd be in, a situation where you would have some exposure, to that. But again, I think the highest interest rate I've seen on urban renewal debt over a 15-year period over the last several years is nothing over 6.
What's in the highest debt coverage ratio you've ever seen on an urban renewal?
On urban renewal, the numbers I've been working with has been in the 1 1/4 range. There's been some higher ones, but for entities such as this that has an established track record, a long-term record of tax collections and valuations and so forth, I think 1.35 I think would be at the high end of what one might expect. And let me mention on that, is look, the money that they're going to be lending on would be the proven amount of your increment. And that's the way this particular DDA was structured, where the developer is putting the money up front. They're then creating the value and the increment. Now the bank sees the increment that's been created and then is lending off of that base amount. He's not lending off of the forecast of it increasing to some larger amount. He's basing it off of a proven demonstrated valuation. and to get to the question related to taxable assessed value increasing in the given environment, and somewhat going back to measure 5 and then measure 4750, a lot of things changed within the tax structure of the state, moving from a tax base all the way into a tax rate with the implementation of 47 and 50. And capping the growth in taxable assessed value to 3% per year, but letting real market value go wherever it goes. And fortunately, I think at least from a municipal, governmental standpoint, taxes, or I should say, real market values went up considerably faster than the 3%, which ultimately provided considerable stability with respect to almost take it for granted approach to getting the 3% off your existing assessed value together with growth. Well, as you might expect, that is starting to change a little bit, and it's accelerated. In this particular area, it's come into play. In other areas, it's actually in the say, Deschutes County and in Crook County, it's accelerated, quite a bit more than locally here. This particular chart, we've done some sensitivity analysis. I've had some several discussions with with the assessor here and with other real estate professionals, and looking at what's transpired over the last few years. This is going back to fiscal year 2010, and then looking out to fiscal 2013 with respect to real market value and where that ultimately is, where it may impact taxable assessed value. What you'll see with the blue column represents fiscal 2010 information. If we look off to the far left, $70 million worth of property within the urban renewal district had a real TAV to real market ratio of 60% or less than 60%. So very comfortable that any future increases are going to be no problem seeing a 3% growth off of those properties. And as you move across the bottom here, you'll see the number of properties that are ultimately, in the far right column, if we look at the blue in 2010, there were just 2 properties that were 100% or in compression. So literally, nothing at that particular point in time, insignificant. Over the last, couple of years, that's moved dramatically. You've seen the blue bar, on the far left, and less than 60%. It's gone down to, in fiscal 11, which is, say, the current year, we're around 24% of or 24 million from 70-some million. And then I'm projecting that, the value of properties in that particular category are going to continue to go down, and they are moving across the 60, 70, the 70, 80, 80, 90. And you're starting to see, quite a few properties, valuation, in the 80 to 90 and the 90 to 100, and then the 100 plus. The assumptions that we were using, as we look at fiscal 12 and fiscal 13, again, this is per discussion with the Clackamas County Assessor, and then also there's been a recent press release, I think it was in the Clackamas Review, that talked about values within, real estate values within this area, about a 9% reduction year over year to last year. We've utilized a 10% reduction in the forecast on real market value, and then holding flat, no increase whatsoever, across the board in 2013. And then at that point, started to see a more typical, long-term, growth rate of 3% in the real market value going forward. How does that play back with respect to the Rivers development? The Rivers development, in terms of its real market value, is going to be, whatever that ultimately, turns out to be. And they've given us, a projection of what that is. I haven't seen the latest numbers, but the numbers that were put together about 2009, we went through a fairly detailed analysis and evaluation of those, getting to a good solid cap rate and having quite a bit of confidence of what that value was. Looking at where they are today, the cost number in total really hasn't changed all that much. The development, as I understand it, in terms of square footage, does not appear to have changed significantly. What has changed is this ratio of taxable assessed value to real market value has gone up considerably, which in the end, that ratio would ultimately be applied back to this particular development. And at this point in time, it's actually has worked to the renewal agency's advantage. Looking at 3 years, 4 years ago, it would have been at less than 60% that ratio applied to the 2 million. And the analysis we were doing at that time, showed the TAV down around 112, 115 million dollars versus today the number is closer to 150 million dollars. That would not necessarily change again. If the real market value stays roughly the same, and if for some reason the real market value ratios continue to compress with TAV, the higher ratio is going to apply back to that $200 million. So, it may be actually in the agency's best interest that TAV, that ratio actually goes up versus, going down. But the model right now is after 2013 is that ratio basically stays consistent, in the forecast going forward. Okay.
So are you going to show us the cash flow using those scenarios, and also can we see a contraction scenario as well? Because based on other a majority of the studies indicate that when you have this type of development, it basically reduces the jobs and the real market values. So I think it's reasonable to look at a contraction scenario.
We could, and I think, I'm not sure which studies you're referring to. The analysis and research, I guess, that we've done would show that actually there's a more likely scenario of real estate values stabilizing with a development such as this, occurring and likely, establishing a floor. I don't.
Talking about the businesses that are lost, that are replaced by the rivers.
And again, I'm not sure what studies you're ultimately referring to. The analysis and the evaluation that we're familiar with would be that not taking place.
I can provide you with that information.
Sure, and that's fine. As far as the analysis that we've done, we're not anticipating that particular thing occurring. We're showing a 10% reduction in the current year because that's appears to be a known number. Per again, conversations with a number of different individuals, I think it's realistic right now to show something in the neighborhood of a 0% in terms of a stabilization of real estate values in this particular market in the greater Clackamas County area. This type of development, if it were to proceed, the expectation would be is it would establish effectively a floor, and then you start to see again the more macroeconomics starting to take place with respect to the real estate values beginning to stabilize and begin to start to increase, more consistent with longer term trends. The last piece here, would show you in terms of what is this valuation, the real market valuation, impacts. Then there's, if we were to want to add a fiscal year 2011 up there, that would be total TAV, and that's within the entire district, went up 1.8% this last year, and the incremental TAV went up 2.68%. And recognize that the TAV, the increment, is going to increase by a greater percentage than the overall assessed value because you have a frozen base of approximately $50 million. So you've got a smaller number that you're ultimately taking that increase in doing the divisible math to look at that percentage. The longer this thing goes out, the greater the value that is created within the district, the less impact that particular frozen base has on that percentage adjustment.
Commissioner, Mr. Edgar.
Is there a way that this we could accelerate the payoff? I would love to see a time when we could predetermination at the earliest possible date or time of this Oregon City Urban Renewal Plan area. And so it's is there a way that you could do some analysis that reflected what we could do? Like, is there 10-year bonds that at more favorable rates, interest rates, and we just accelerate the payoff of this? I get nervous when we start looking at these things and other projects, and 30 years from now, we will never have terminated this, and this urban renewal district, and where anybody has received any value. It's just a continuation of added taxes as a result of paying for services that are not being properly funded through an ordinary tax base.
Well, the answer is, I think you can certainly look to that. The issue with a 10-year debt in this particular situation, or with, normally when you're dealing with major infrastructure investment, is it increases the annual debt service, which then increases the revenue requirement ultimately to cover that. The nature of the bond deal would likely be, it's not uncommon at all, say with a 15-year amortization, to have a prepayment clause capability, generally in the 10-year range, to be able to go ahead and pay off bonds early if that's, desired. If you recall within the urban, the report on this particular site, with this particular development and the Cove developments, there's the potential for this urban renewal district within the maximum indebtedness defined to be able to, close this thing, certainly within a 20-year horizon. Without one or both of those projects, the likelihood is, the maximum indebtedness would not be reached until well after that 20-year horizon. And that's just, a policy question in terms of how you want to, proceed with getting those things, addressed. But certainly there's the ability to go ahead and pay off the debt earlier if the funds are available. The advice, financial advice would be to, put together, something that is not going to stress the organization in terms of being able to make those necessary payments to, from the revenue that ultimately be created, and then as those revenues increase, to be able to target those where you may want to, whether it's debt reduction or to other projects within the plan.
Commissioner Roth. I see on page 17 of it says that the analysis was limited to using information previously submitted by Leland and Pacific Property Search, and so it's, the income tax stuff was all done on older data, correct?
Yes.
Given that the Bellas finally announced on television Saturday night that they are not coming to Oregon City, shouldn't these numbers be reworked?
They could be, if that's something that's desired. It hasn't been requested at this particular point in time, but it certainly could be done if that was.
Was Cabela's even in that when they did that?
I don't know. No. There was a big box of some kind.
It wasn't there.
My expectation would be those numbers are going to be, they're really more order of magnitude type numbers. If you're going to be creating 650,000 square feet, I think those are representative of what's likely to happen within, a certain, given amount of margin of, of error. But to get extremely precise on it, that really I don't think was the intent of that particular graphic, was to just show the, again, the order of magnitude associated with the development.
Commissioner DeCita?
A basic fundamentals question. A lot of this analysis throws from the out of the blocks kind of assumption of $200 million real market value. Could you explain for us what's the methodology in establishing that figure of $200 million?
The methodology that was used by the developer, that was, again, it's a few years old, and the recent conversations I've had with CenterCal reemphasize that they're approaching it the same way, which it gets back to a market valuation approach, which is to look at their total costs, their total revenue stream, getting to a net operating income, and then doing, a return on investment type of approach to the valuation. that same type of approach is what the county assessor ultimately will use. And again, I haven't seen their latest pro formas. CenterCal's indicated to me that they're looking at the same type of information in the similar type of cap rate relative to current market conditions to come to their $200 million number.
So the assessor is going to base valuation for purposes of urban renewal on the income stream of the project.
The tax assessor could care less about urban renewal. The tax assessor is going to value the property based on what the real market value is using the different techniques that they use, including in that would be utilization of net operating income relative to a cap rate that would exist at that particular point in time. They'll also verify that back with other approaches that they use, such as the cost approach. So if they've got $250 million into this thing and the net operating income may value that at $200 million, they may use something in between, but they'll use a number of models, including the net operating income.
Okay, so you said that was provided by the developer, and you said it's a little bit, it hasn't been updated.
I haven't seen the updated version of their pro formas. I've just talked with the developer about their assumptions and so forth that they've used and where that is,
okay.
And it's again the same type of information that we saw previously.
And moving forward, how are we going to, as a commission, maybe there's a question for Dan and David, how are we as a commission going to get updated numbers for that real market value out of the blocks kind of assumption?
I would assume it would be similar to what transpired previously, which is they provided that information to us and allowed us to go through it and make some decisions. One of the things we have talked about is to what degree do you go through the verification process or not. It's right now to get to an appraisal, let's say, of what that might be worth is a very difficult task. Talking with the assessor, valuing commercial real estate in today's market is just a very difficult thing to do. To value property that is not yet even built, that's a whole nother game. So we would be able to value the, come to some maybe reasonable conclusions with respect to these are reasonable costs associated with this type of building. These appear to be reasonable expenses associated with this particular type of development. And this appears to be reasonable net operating income, and hopefully is that a reasonable cap rate. Those are all things that can be ascertained, I think, through some analysis. And again, what we had happened before was they willingly provided that information when it got to that particular point in time to do so. You can do that type of thing. There's also been some discussion about do you look to change the DDA or add some language within the DDA to put the onus on the developer to create a given level of real market value. And then it's not necessarily something, if it doesn't create that value, do you ultimately reduce the maximum reimbursement? Those are things that you guys can certainly talk with legal counsel and staff in terms of whether you want to pursue those options or alternatives or not.
Thank you.
Any other questions for Mr. Hart?
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
I think we're kind of running short of time, and we were hoping to walk on that agenda item. I guess I'd only ask for a few minutes to indicate to you that, and this could be a fairly simple request, sort of a housekeeping matter. The declaration that was signed by the City Commission was supposed to have been signed by the Urban Renewal Commission, and we're not in any way asking for any kind of transfer of property here. So I wanted to just respond to Mr. Edgar's concern about the city giving this, or Urban Renewal giving this property to the city. This is still Urban Renewal property. And the background on this is probably about 16 months ago, we came to a work session and showed you these parcels that we were intending to use as wetland mitigation and floodplain mitigation, wetland restoration for the jug handle project to address some of the zoning requirements for water quality, resource area, and floodplain. And at that time, we showed you the picture of the blocks and said, these are urban renewal properties. Is there any problem with that? Because actually, since I've worked in the city for 15 years, those two little parcels that are scrunched between I-205 and the Union Pacific Railroad were envisioned as being, gosh, wouldn't it be neat if we could do a wetlands restoration project there someday? And by the way, it could be a great place to do some floodplain cut and fill balancing someday. And that was always discussed in the context of them being urban renewal properties. Then last April 7th, excuse me, I'm trying to rush. Last April 7th, we came to the Urban Renewal Commission for a work session and gave you a complete update on the project and talked about those properties in terms of, the final design wasn't done yet, but we're still talking about them in terms of the wetland restoration and floodplain mitigation. So it's not really a surprise that these properties have been under that plan for a long time. So I was just wondering if you might consider, it essentially means that the Urban Renewal Agency accepts the covenant instead of the City Commission. I have copies if you'd like. I can understand that we are very rushed right now, but the same token, it sure would be nice to have that groundbreaking ceremony tomorrow without a glitch that I think it's not a big problem, really. I think it means that we don't have, our land use compliance is a little off until we get the declaration signed, but oh, and then there were some questions that Ms. Walters had, which I can take offline or send an email or whatever, but since we're short on time, I was just wondering if we could make this somewhat of a simple matter, because the intent of these properties has been before the Urban Renewal Commission for a long time. And I think, Chair Walters, you were the chair when we came like 18 months ago, or maybe not that long ago, 14 months.
I'll ask the attorney, is there any problem with putting forward a motion and a study session?
No, the state public meetings law says that new matters can be brought to the agenda. The fact that this was noticed as a work session doesn't change the ability of the agency to consider new matters.
I move that the Urban Renewal Agency Commission accept the covenants that were previously accepted by the City Commission.
Second.
That's a question. What was the vote of the City Commission on this?
Zero?
Yes.
I think it was part of the consent agenda, if I remember.
It really is wrapping up the condition of approval of the land use permit.
Mr. Nishida.
Again, I'm not ready to do this tonight. If we put it on the agenda for a regularly noticed meeting, regular meeting and have a discussion on it. But I'm not prepared to do this tonight, and I think it is a bigger discussion.
I'd like to be able to do it because I'm sure there's nothing wrong with it, but I haven't seen it. I mean, I've got a responsibility, I think, to at least review the documents before I vote and understand what I'm voting on, and I don't have a clue what this is. So I'd love to say yes, and I can understand that it probably will get voted on sometime.
Yeah. But I understand your situation, and I do have them, and probably I should have passed them out so you could have been reading them during the meeting, like reading other things, but I didn't think that far ahead.
I'll ask City Manager, can we schedule a meeting in 2 weeks?
You can have a special meeting for this in 2 days. In theory, I mean, really, you could, I'd have to look at the calendar. Right?
You could even be done electronically or over the phone.
Oh, you could?
What's that?
Bill was just suggesting you could have an electronic meeting over the phone as long as you notice it.
I hate to throw it up, but geez, we gotta read it at least. I can't put it on until I read it.
I don't think you
Well,
You're going to include the city record of the City Commission consent? want me to include?
Just let us know, the date and, the vote.
No problem.
I'm sorry, Commissioner Aker.
I have no problem with this land being a part of the city. I just would like to see if it's put into conservation through a covenant for perpetuity, that the city, it's part of the city, and we trade a parcel of land owned by the city of somewhat similar value to the Urban Renewal Commission, and at least give us something that we can work with that is within our charter for economic development. As I proposed in my letter, I wouldn't mind seeing the parcel next to KFC and on 12th and Main get transferred into the hands of the Urban Renewal Commission, so we can start with something positive, with positive impacts into downtown Oregon City, such as creating maybe parking or something of significance. But I think that that should be part of any type of an agreement to get this put through. And short of that, I think that we're not fiduciarily not being responsible to just sign away a covenant on it, in as much as that we were involved into paying quite a bit of money, $630,000 to Simpson for these two parcels and another parcel. And these parcels represent 4.86 acres, and the other one is 4.16 acres. That's a lot of land. And I just think that each acre has a composite value or a portion of the value. And for us to not get something back from the city on this is just not smart. It's not smart for the citizens.
In lieu of the time, I'd like to call for the question, please.
Well, I'm going to ask one question. Who owns what jurisdiction owns this properties?
The Urban Renewal Commission.
That's what I thought. Those are on city properties.
Right.
What?
The property that you mentioned belongs to the Urban Renewal.
No,
It does.
No,
I think
it does
there's some
not.
confusion. Well, I'm not talking anything about property transfer
Yeah.
here. This is a declaration to keep it in water resources and floodplain in perpetuity. And it was part of the land use application that the Urban Renewal Commission was informed about and fully apprised of and informed about in terms of what those parcels were going to be used for. We made an error in taking to the city commission, whenever that was. If you'd known, we would have had this taken care of a month ago. So I'm happy to bring it back. No, I just want to have there be clarification that this isn't talking about property transfer at all.
Anyway, motion's on the floor. Call the question.
Call the question?
And wait a minute. I want to make sure I can bring it back if for some reason it doesn't get approved, because it's important. And it's,
That means your motion to put it on the agenda.
No, I've made a motion. I haven't changed it.
The motion is to approve it.
Yes.
To reconsider previous motion, only member who voted against it could bring it back before the commission. So if it's denied, a member who voted against it may bring it back before. In other words, indicating that they may have a different position than what was.
Somebody who votes for it changes vote against it.
They can, but they can't call it back.
They really do that on the same floor.
Senate has its own.
I have every confidence that this is going to get resolved favorably. I would like to have a little more time. I'd like to honor the other commissioners.
I'll pull the motion.
Thank you.
With a second pull?
Yes.
Thank you.
so is there any potential of entertaining an electronic vote if I distribute the materials?
No, I'd like there to be public comment during a regular meeting.
All right then. Is that Is it consensus?
Should we pull it?
No.
We'd like to have the information distributed and then schedule it for the next available agenda.
Nancy, is there a problem with just putting it on item 1 at the very next meeting? Okay, so we'll plan on making it item 1 here.
Thank you. Okay.
Chair Walters, I'm sorry to interrupt. We do have 2 people signed up for citizen comments.
Okay. What is the typical? I haven't been in a situation with the. Pardon? Everybody willing to sit in the?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Yes. I'm sorry. We have William Gifford and Nick Borowski.
Madam Chair and Commissioners, I'll try to make this brief. My name is William Gifford and I live in Oregon City. I want to tell you that many of you know that my wife teaches math at Oregon City High School occasionally, and she was teaching recently, and a co-teacher was teaching the lesson about square footage. And in the lesson, the instructor uses an example to the class and says, for example, he says, when Cabela's comes in down to the Rivers Project, and my wife hastened to point out to him that it was not a done deal. We were recently over at the coast, and I was talking. Astoria is celebrating their 200th anniversary, and I was chatting with the woman at the information desk by the Astor column, and I was telling her, and she was talking about the museums, and I told her about the Rivers Project, and mentioned Cabela's to her, and she was astonished. She says, "That's the greatest thing that could happen to Oregon. Got to get that in there just as soon as possible. I love Cabela's." Blah 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 blah. I said, "But there's some opposition to it." She was flabbergasted. Absolutely flabbergasted that there would be opposition to that project. And I guess all my comments boil down to this. I am constantly bombarded with questions from neighbors, from citizens asking me, why haven't you started that? And I really want to let you know that we're watching to find out how soon can this be going, and I hope that I just have to trust that you are going to be as diligent as possible to get a fair deal for everything and make this project go forward. Thanks.
Thank you.
My name is Nick Borowski. I live in Portland. I own 3 pieces of property, 2 of which downtown and one that supports downtown through parking. I'm not sure how many of you saw the article in today's Oregonian, but Walmart stores commissioned a study, and they said that the Portland metro area has the capacity to support an additional 17 stores. This seems to be contrary to the off-the-wall, which I will call them, reports that we've seen from others saying that the Portland area is over-retailed already. I would behoove you to look at that article if you haven't seen it. If you'd like, I would be happy to email the link to that article to you to make it simple. I would also behoove you to look carefully at the proposal that is before us on the rivers and the numbers of clientele that will bring visitors to Portland from 100 to 150 mile draw radius, how that will impact tourism. As a downtown property owner, I'm very excited about the prospects of both the rivers and what can happen as we move forward over the next decade with the Blue Heron property and the jobs that will be created and help out the families that have been displaced. I hope the rivers goes forward quickly and starts to create those jobs to help those families out and also support our real estate values. Also, Ms. Walters, you mentioned that you had studies that showed businesses being lost. If I could get a copy of that, I'd appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. We have 2 more, Dan Holliday and Dan Fowler. We've heard many comments already in the nature of the time. Do you have anything new for us tonight, or?
I was just here, we could get wrapped up sooner, thank you.
So my name's Dan Holiday. I live here in Oregon City. Someone texted me on my way. I'm commuting back and forth to the Dalles for work now, so that might be one reason why we might want to bring some jobs to Oregon City. So folks like me might actually be able to work somewhere less than an hour and a half from home. But someone texted me and said that Mr. Edgar, you talked about some Walmart store blowing up in Ohio.
They closed it down.
Okay,
They
so
just closed it down.
so
They walked away from it.
and I want to explain what happened there, because I actually when I saw this earlier email, I actually called the town. I talked to the development director. He explained the situation with Walmart. Walmart didn't follow the city's codes, and they didn't follow their own engineering codes, and they used segmented sewer pipe when they built their building. And when the building settled, the sewer pipe came apart, and the store was able to be to have methane gas intrude. The other part of that situation is that Walmart had 3 stores in that general geographic area, and they were basically cannibalizing customers from those 2 stores. So this gave them the perfect economic opportunity to walk away from that store and use a different excuse to say, well, it was the gas. It wasn't our bad economic decision to build a store that was cannibalizing from our 3 markets. So sometimes what we hear or read on the internet, surprise, isn't true. And you have to go back and actually do some investigating and actually talk to the actual people and the actual folks that are there. That's all I have to say.
Thank you.
And wasn't that in a mall that other stores stayed open?
Yeah, and they're still there.
Dan Fowler, Oregon City. I understand that you're in executive session on your negotiations on the DDA. I would just like to ask that there be some type of an update given on the Rivers negotiations, not anything specific or that you obviously cannot say, but something for the public. The public has been waiting for some type of an update. How many issues you originally had with the DDA, how many have been satisfied? How often do you communicate? When is your goal date to be completed or your hoped for date? Those general type of information items, if you can, or if you can direct the city manager to do so. The public, I believe, deserves some type of an informational update from the commission on how it's going. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I guess with that, we're adjourned.